It was the summer of 2007, and I was working as a camp counselor in the Blue Ridge Mountains near a small town in western North Carolina. Our camp specialized in outdoor experiences, and one of the highlights for the older kids was a multi-day hike along the Appalachian Trail. This stretch of trail was remote and rugged, perfect for a true wilderness adventure. My co-counselor, Jen, and I were leading a group of 10 high schoolers on a week-long trek. Jen was in her early 20s, like me, and had grown up in the mountains. She was confident, experienced, and tough as nails, which made her the perfect person to co-lead these trips. That particular night, we were camped on a ridge overlooking a densely forested valley. The air was cool but not cold, and the stars were impossibly bright, scattered across the black sky like shards of glass. It was one of those nights when everything feels still and safe, and the idea of danger seems absurd. We decided to cowboy camp that night. No tents, just a large tarp spread on the ground where everyone could lay their sleeping bags. It was easier than setting up shelters, and the kids loved falling asleep under the open sky. Jen and I stayed up later than the rest, talking quietly and keeping an eye on the fire until it burned down to embers. When the last flames died out, we crawled into our sleeping bags on opposite ends of the tarp. The kids were between us, snoring softly, and within minutes, I drifted off. I woke to the sound of Jen's sharp intake of breath. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the campsite. I turned to see her sitting up, staring at the ground next to her sleeping bag. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly open, and her hands trembled as she held a piece of paper. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice groggy. She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed at the ground. There, mere inches from where her head had been, was a hunting knife buried deep into the dirt. The blade glinted dully in the morning light. My stomach dropped. "Jen," I asked again, more awake now, my heart hammering in my chest. She handed me the note without saying a word. It was a scrap of lined paper, the edges jagged as if torn from a notebook. The handwriting was neat, almost playful, and the words sent a chill down my spine. "We could have killed you last night." My mind raced. Who would do this?
Why?
The note's tone was chillingly casual, like a twisted joke. I looked around the campsite. The kids were still asleep, oblivious. Everything else appeared normal, no signs of a struggle or disturbance. But someone had been here, close enough to leave the knife and the note. Close enough to kill us, if they'd wanted to. "We need to wake them up," Jen said finally, her voice low and steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We need to get out of here." I nodded, and we moved quickly, waking the kids as calmly as we could, telling them we wanted an early start to beat the heat. They grumbled, but didn't question it. Jen and I packed up the tarp and extinguished what little was left of the fire, all the while scanning the woods for any sign of movement. My skin prickled with the feeling of being watched, though I saw no one. We hiked for hours that day, pushing harder than usual. Jen and I took turns glancing over our shoulders, looking for anything, anyone, that seemed out of place. But the trail was empty, just us and the endless green of the forest. By late afternoon, we reached a public trailhead where a small ranger station was located. It felt like stepping back into civilization, even though we were still miles from the nearest town. Jen and I left the kids with another counselor who'd met us there and went inside to talk to the ranger. We showed him the knife and the note, explaining what had happened. His reaction surprised me. He didn't seem shocked or even particularly concerned. Instead, he sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "This happens sometimes," he said, his voice tired. "It's probably the military guys." "Military?" I repeated, confused. He explained that the area was occasionally used for training exercises by special forces units, including Army Rangers. They operated in the woods, practicing reconnaissance and survival skills. Sometimes, he said, they messed with hikers, Never anything violent, just pranks meant to scare people. They think it's funny, he said, though his tone suggested he didn't share their sense of humor. But it's not. I'll report it, but there's not much else we can do. Jen and I exchanged a look. The explanation made sense, but it didn't make me feel any better. These weren't ordinary pranksters. They were highly trained soldiers. If they could get that close to us without anyone noticing, what else were they capable of? And what if it hadn't been a prank? That night, back at the camp's main lodge, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment I saw the knife, the note, the way Jen's hands had trembled. I thought about how vulnerable we'd been, lying there in the open, unaware of who or what was lurking in the dark. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to push the incident out of my mind. But every time I led another group into the woods, the fear crept back in. I found myself double-checking campsites, setting up extra watches at night, and scanning the forest for shadows that didn't belong. Jen and I never talked about it again, at least not in detail. But I know it stayed with her, too. We both finished the summer and moved on, but that morning on the ridge left a mark. 15 years later, I still think about it whenever I go camping. I wonder who left that knife and why they chose to scare us instead of harm us. I wonder if they were watching us from the trees as we packed up and hiked away, laughing at how easily they'd rattled us. Most of all, I wonder what would have happened if they decided to do more than leave a note. I was about 6 years old when my dad and I went on a camping trip in a national park out west. I don't remember exactly where it was, but the area was remote, with towering trees, wide open skies, and a lake that looked like glass when the wind was still. It was just the two of us on the trip. My mom had stayed home because of work. My dad loved camping, and he wanted to share that with me, to teach me how to love the outdoors the way he did. I don't remember much of the trip in detail, but one moment is burned into my memory, clear as day. It was late afternoon, maybe an hour or two before sunset, and we were walking along the edge of the lake. My dad and I were skipping stones, something we'd been practicing all summer. He'd found the perfect spot where the shoreline was sandy and the water stretched out smooth and calm. I was trying to get my stones to bounce more than twice, but I wasn't very good at it. My dad kept encouraging me, laughing when my stones plopped straight into the water. It felt like one of those scenes from a family movie, just a dad and his kid, enjoying a quiet moment in nature. As we walked along, we noticed someone sitting against a tree a little further up the shore. At first, we didn't think much of it. People were always hiking or fishing around the lake. But the longer we looked, the more we realized something wasn't quite right. The person wasn't moving at all. They were slumped forward a little, their chin resting on their chest. They had on a wide-brimmed hat, and their clothes looked dirty, like they'd been out there for a while. "It's getting cold," my dad said, mostly to himself. He sounded concerned, though I didn't understand why at the time. "We should check on him." We started walking toward the man. As we got closer, I noticed something strange, the smell. It wasn't the kind of fresh, piney smell you'd expect in the woods. Instead, it was sour and sharp, like a bathroom that hadn't been cleaned in weeks. It made my nose wrinkle, and I instinctively held my breath. My dad glanced down at me, his face serious now, and told me to hang back while he went ahead. I watched as he approached the man. He called out to him, but the man didn't respond. My dad stopped for a second, then called out again, louder this time. Still nothing. My dad hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer and tapped the man on the shoulder. What happened next is something I'll never forget. The man's body shifted, slumping slightly to the side, and I heard a sound, a crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. It was quiet but distinct, and it made my stomach turn. The man's hat fell off as his head tilted, and I saw his face. Half of it was dark, almost purple, the skin swollen and tight. The other half was pale, waxy, and sunken. One of his eyes was completely red, the blood vessels inside burst, while the other stared blankly ahead. His mouth hung open slightly, and flies buzzed around his face. I didn't understand what I was looking at first, but I knew it was wrong. My dad turned and rushed back toward me, his face pale and his expression tense. He grabbed my hand and started walking quickly back toward the main trail. I tried to ask him what was wrong, but he just told me to keep moving. I could feel how tightly he was holding my hand, almost like he was afraid I'd run off. The smell clung to the air, following us even as we left the shoreline. I wanted to cover my nose, but my dad's grip didn't loosen until we were well away from the tree. We made it back to the ranger station just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The station wasn't much, just a small wooden building with a porch and a radio antenna. My dad told me to stay with one of the rangers while he talked to another man in uniform. The ranger who stayed with me was a woman with bright yellow hair tied back in a ponytail. I remember thinking she looked like Big Bird, which made me feel a little better for some reason. I sat on a bench while my dad and the ranger grabbed some supplies, a flashlight, a map, and what looked like a first aid kit. They headed back toward the lake, leaving me with Big Bird. She gave me a candy bar and asked me about our trip, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept going back to the man by the tree. I couldn't stop picturing his face, the way it looked like it belonged to two different people, and the strange, wet crunch when his body shifted. It felt like hours before my dad came back, though it was probably only an hour or so. He looked exhausted, and his clothes were dirty, like he'd fallen in the mud. He didn't say much, just picked me up and carried me back to our campsite. That night, he stayed up by the fire while I tried to sleep. I remember waking up a few times and seeing him sitting there, staring into the flames with a blank expression. The next morning, we packed up and left the park. My dad didn't say much on the drive home, and I didn't ask any questions. I think we both just wanted to forget what had happened, to pretend it was just another camping trip. But I couldn't forget, not completely. Every time I close my eyes, I can still see the man's face, the way the flies hovered around him, and the look on my dad's face when he came back to get me. Years later, I learned that the man we found had likely been dead for a couple of days. The rangers thought he might have been a solo hiker who'd gotten lost or injured and couldn't make it back to camp. They didn't release much information, but my dad told me once that it didn't look like foul play. It was just a tragic accident, the kind that happens more often than you'd think in places like that. Even now, as an adult, I think about that trip whenever I go hiking or camping. It's not the kind of fear that makes you jump at shadows or hear footsteps in the dark. It's a quiet, nagging fear, the kind that reminds you how small and vulnerable you are out there in the wilderness. Nature doesn't care who you are or what plans you've made. It's beautiful, yes, but it's also indifferent. And sometimes it leaves you with memories you'll never forget. I've been camping for as long as I can remember. My dad taught me how to set up a tent when I was little, and by the time I was in my 20s, I was going on trips with friends, sometimes even solo. I loved the peace and quiet, the way nature made you forget about everything else, and the sense of adventure. But the summer of 2023 was different. My boyfriend Jake and I decided to go on a trip to the Red River Gorge, just the two of us. We'd always camped with groups before, so this was going to be our first time alone out there. It was supposed to be relaxing, a chance to unwind and get away from everything. We arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, ready to start the short hike to our campsite. The weather was perfect, cool with just enough sun to warm us up as we made our way through the forest. We were excited, chatting about random things, looking forward to the quiet nights and the campfire. But as we were unloading our gear from the car, two guys appeared from the trailhead. They didn't say anything at first, just kind of watched us. Their clothes were worn, and their eyes looked a little too curious. One of them was tall and scruffy, the other smaller with a hat pulled down low. They exchanged a glance before walking toward an old VW camper van parked just off the trail. The van looked like it hadn't been driven in years, the paint faded and peeling. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. It wasn't anything unusual to see people out in the wilderness. Maybe they were just another group of campers. I gave them a quick wave and turned back to my boyfriend, telling myself I was overthinking it. Jake and I made our way to the campsite, which wasn't far, maybe a mile or so from the trailhead. I'd camped in this area a few times before, so I knew it pretty well. There were several spots around, but I wanted to pick one that would give us some privacy away from the main trail. As we walked, I noticed a small fire up on the hill. It wasn't far, but I still felt like we'd be a little more secluded if we camped farther down. I told Jake I was going to check out a few more spots before we settled. By the time we found a spot and set up our tent, it was getting dark. I started collecting firewood, thinking about how nice it would be to sit by the fire and relax after the hike. But just as I was bending down to pick up a log, a voice called out from behind me. I turned around, startled, and saw the same guy from the trailhead, the one who'd been eyeing us. "Hey there," he said, smiling a little too wide. "Need any firewood?" I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I politely shook my head. "No thanks, we're good. We've got plenty of wood around here." He didn't seem to take the hint. "I've got some for sale," he said. "Only $10 for a bundle. It's a lot harder to find wood around here than you think." That didn't sit right with me. We were surrounded by trees, and there was no shortage of fallen branches. "I think we're good," I said again, trying to be polite but firm. He didn't seem put off by my response. "Been here a while," he continued. "Couple weeks now. You won't find much left. I've been clearing out a lot of the stuff for firewood." I frowned, puzzled. "How long have you been out here?" I asked. "Almost a month," he said, without missing a beat. That's when I got the first real red flag. The longest you could stay in this area was 2 weeks. I wasn't sure what he was up to, but I was starting to feel uncomfortable. I decided to push a little further, asking him how long he'd been camping up here alone. He hesitated, then said, "Oh, yeah, I've been alone for most of it. Just me up here." But something didn't add up. If he was alone, why had I heard him yelling just a few minutes ago? I asked him about it. "I heard you yelling earlier with someone else," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. He stammered. Yeah. Well, there's some other guys across the river, but they're just friends. They're camped over there." At that point, I wasn't buying it. His stories weren't making sense. He said he was alone, but he was talking about other people. His tone shifted, and he started telling us about his life, how he'd come from Pennsylvania, how he had taken a bus to Lexington, Kentucky, and then ended up here in the woods, living off snakes and bugs and selling firewood to get by. His stories were all over the place, and I could tell he was lying about a lot of it. But what struck me as the most unsettling was when he took us to his camp. He'd been talking about his solo lifestyle, but when we reached his site, I saw the truth. His camp wasn't just one person's gear. It was multiple tents, tarps, and supplies that clearly weren't his alone. The site looked abandoned, but it was clearly set up for more than just one person. He'd lied about everything, and it made me feel sick to my stomach. It was already dark, and I was ready to be rid of him. I thanked him for helping with the fire and told him it was time for him to head back up the hill. But as he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I whispered to Jake, "We need to leave. Now. I don't care about the tarps or anything else. We need to get out of here." Jake agreed without hesitation, and we quietly packed up what we could, careful not to make too much noise. We left the tarps behind, knowing they'd be too loud to take down without alerting him. As I stood up, ready to go, I heard his voice again. "How's it going down there?" I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. There was no way we were staying another minute. I grabbed Jake's hand, and we silently made our way toward the trail, our footsteps muffled by the thick forest floor. Every rustle of leaves made my stomach turn. I was sure he wasn't alone, that there were others hiding somewhere nearby, watching us. We were alone in the woods, and I felt more vulnerable than I ever had before. We didn't stop until we reached the trailhead. The moment we got back to the car, I called the park rangers. I explained everything, how we'd encountered the man, his strange behavior, and how he'd lied about being alone. The rangers said they'd check it out, but by then I didn't care. We were out of there. We had no idea who that guy was or what he was really up to, but we were sure of one thing: he wasn't just camping. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly avoided something much worse. I don't know if we were in real danger that night, but I'll never forget the way I felt, like something was off, like we were being watched. I've been camping many times since, but I always trust my gut now. If something doesn't feel right, I don't stick around to find out why.